Pam Bondi entered the courtroom with confidence, ready to present her case. But from the moment the hearing began, Judge Howard Gates made it clear that he had no intention of giving her a fair chance. He interrupted her arguments, dismissed crucial evidence, and even made condescending remarks in front of the entire courtroom. The tension grew with each passing moment as Bondi struggled to get a word in. Despite his blatant bias, Bondi remained composed. She had come prepared for a battle, and she wasn't about to back down. As the judge continued his attempts to undermine her, she decided it was time to reveal what she had been holding back all along. The courtroom fell silent as she pulled out a file, a piece of evidence no one saw coming. She began reading aloud from the documents, detailing a web of corruption that led straight to Judge Gates himself. The accusations were damning: bribes, case manipulation, and a hidden connection to the very defendant he was supposedly ruling over. Gasps filled the room as the judge's arrogance turned to shock. His face went pale. He stammered, attempting to dismiss the claims, but Bondi wasn't finished. With a calm yet powerful voice, she presented undeniable proof: bank records, witness statements, and a signed affidavit. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom doors suddenly swung open as law enforcement officers entered. The judge's panic was evident now, his authority slipping away with every second. The officers approached the bench, and, in a stunning turn of events, Judge Howard Gates was placed under arrest. The same courtroom where he had once ruled with unchecked power now bore witness to his downfall. Pam Bondi stood firm, watching as justice was finally served. The moment was a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who sit on the bench. The scandal would send shockwaves through the legal system, proving once and for all that the truth always has a way of coming to light. As Judge Howard Gates was led away in handcuffs, murmurs and whispers rippled through the courtroom. Reporters in the gallery scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing as the once powerful judge faced the consequences of his corruption. Some members of the audience sat in stunned silence, while others nodded in satisfaction, realizing they had just witnessed history in the making. Pam Bondi remained composed, though a hint of triumph flickered in her eyes. She had fought for justice, and she had won. But this was just the beginning. With the judge exposed, questions arose about how deep the corruption truly ran. How many other cases had been tampered with? How many innocent people had suffered under Gates's rulings? Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Protesters, already suspicious of the judicial system, gathered with signs demanding further investigations. Officials had no choice but to launch a full-scale inquiry, digging into Gates's past rulings, financial records, and connections to powerful figures. Meanwhile, Bondi addressed the press. Standing before a sea of microphones, she spoke with the same confidence that had carried her through the trial. "This is not just about one corrupt judge," she declared. "This is about ensuring that our justice system remains fair, honest, and free from those who seek to exploit it for personal gain." As reporters shouted questions, one thing was clear: this case was far from over. Investigators were already uncovering new leads, and rumors swirled about other high-profile names being implicated. The fight for justice had only just begun, and Pam Bondi was ready to take on whatever came next. Somewhere in a cold, dimly lit holding cell, Judge Howard Gates sat in silence, his mind racing. He had ruled over so many lives, believing himself untouchable. Now he was on the other side of the law, awaiting his own trial, a trial that would determine just how deep his betrayal had gone. As Judge Howard Gates sat in his holding cell, the weight of his downfall pressed heavily on him. His once powerful name was now being dragged through the mud in headlines across the country. News networks ran non-stop coverage of his arrest, dissecting every detail of the corruption scandal. Former defendants who had suffered under his rulings came forward, demanding their cases be reviewed. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi wasn't finished. She knew that Gates had not acted alone. With her legal team, she began compiling evidence that pointed to a network of corruption within the judicial system. Bribes, case rigging, and backroom deals, it was all there, hidden in plain sight. If Gates had abused his power, how many others were doing the same? The scandal reached the highest levels of government, forcing officials to take action. An emergency review of past cases overseen by Gates was launched. Several convictions were overturned as new evidence of misconduct surfaced. Some of Gates's closest associates, other judges, lawyers, and even politicians, began distancing themselves, afraid of being implicated. But it was too late. Investigators had already begun looking into their connections. The courtroom that had once been Gates's domain was now the setting for his own trial. Cameras flashed as he was led in, shackled, his once pristine robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit. He sat before a new judge, a fair and impartial one this time, who listened as prosecutors laid out the case against him. Bondi watched from the gallery, knowing that this was more than just one man facing justice. This was a message to everyone who thought they were above the law. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Witnesses testified against him, former colleagues, bribed officials, even those he had once sentenced unfairly. The verdict came quickly, guilty, on all counts. The moment the judge announced the sentence, a wave of relief spread through the IDE courtroom. Gates was handed a decades-long prison term, ensuring he would never abuse his power again. Outside, Bondi addressed the media once more. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We must remain vigilant and continue fighting for a justice system that serves the people, not the powerful." As the crowd cheered, she knew her work was far from over. There were more battles to fight, more truths to uncover. But for now, she had done what many thought was impossible. She had taken down a corrupt judge and restored faith in the very system he had tried to manipulate. And somewhere, behind prison walls, Howard Gates sat alone, realizing that the power he once wielded was gone forever. As the prison gates clanked shut behind Howard Gates, the reality of his fate settled in. The man who once controlled the destiny of countless individuals now had no control over his own. He was just another inmate, stripped of his status, forced to live among those he had once sentenced. Some of the very people he had, wrongfully, convicted were now his fellow prisoners, and they did not forget. Fear crept into his eyes as he realized that in here there were no favors, no bribes, no special privileges. Outside, Pam Bondi's victory sent shockwaves through the legal system. The case had exposed more than just one corrupt judge. It had revealed an entire network of individuals who had abused their power for personal gain. Investigators, emboldened by Bondi's relentless pursuit of justice, continued digging. More arrests followed. Officials, attorneys, even law enforcement officers who had played a role in the corruption. Each name that surfaced only fueled the public's outrage and demand for reform. Bondi found herself at the center of a movement. People from across the country reached out, sharing their own experiences with judicial misconduct. Her office became overwhelmed with requests to investigate other cases, other judges, other instances of injustice that had been ignored for too long. Determined to keep the momentum going, she pushed for legislative reforms, calling for stricter oversight. of the judiciary. Lawmakers, unable to ignore the public's demand, introduced new measures to ensure greater transparency in court proceedings. Mandatory ethics reviews, harsher penalties for judicial corruption, and independent watchdogs to oversee court rulings were now being debated at the highest levels. Meanwhile, Gates struggled to survive in prison. The man who had once ruled his courtroom with arrogance now faced a daily battle just to make it through another day. His former allies abandoned him, refusing to associate with a disgraced judge. He filed for appeals, hoping to find some way out, but every request was denied. The same system he had manipulated for years had now turned its back on him. Months later, Bondi received a message. A high-profile whistleblower, someone deep within the legal system, had come forward with evidence that the corruption went even deeper than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just about Gates. There were more powerful figures pulling the strings, people who had been untouchable until now. She knew what this meant. The fight was far from over. As she prepared for the next battle, one thing was certain. This was no longer just a case. It was a war against corruption, and she wasn't backing down. Pam Bondi sat in her office, reviewing the documents that had just been delivered by the whistleblower. The evidence was staggering. Bank transactions, private emails, confidential memos, all pointing to a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Judge Howard Gates. What had started as a single case had now unraveled into something much bigger. The Uidir whistleblower, a former court clerk named Daniel Reeves, had risked everything to come forward. He claimed that Gates had merely been a pawn, taking orders from higher-ups in the legal and political system. There were powerful figures, judges, politicians, even corporate executives, who had been orchestrating outcomes in courtrooms across the state. Their influence determined who walked free and who was sentenced, all in exchange for money and power. Bondi knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. Gates had been one corrupt judge, but these new players were in a league of their own. They had resources, connections, and the ability to silence anyone who got too close. That night, as she left her office, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It had been there for hours. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. Was she being watched? Threatened? She knew this case was dangerous, but she had come too far to back down now. The next morning, she met with federal investigators. Armed with Reeves's testimony and the stack of evidence, they agreed to launch a secret task force. It was clear that this wasn't just a case of judicial corruption. It was an entire system rigged against the people. As the investigation gained traction, things took a dark turn. Key witnesses began disappearing. One attorney who had agreed to testify was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Another witness, a former judge, suddenly resigned and fled the country. Then came the threats. Bondi received an anonymous note on her car windshield. "Drop the case, or you'll regret it." She refused to be intimidated. Instead, she doubled down, holding a press conference to expose what was happening. "We will not be silenced," she declared. "The people have a right to justice, and I will not stop until every corrupt official is held accountable." The public rallied behind her. Protests erupted across the state, demanding the removal of corrupt judges and politicians. The FBI expanded its investigation, uncovering financial records that linked the conspiracy to some of the most powerful figures in the country. Then came the biggest shock of all. One of the names on the list was a sitting U.S. senator. The revelation sent shockwaves through Washington. The senator denied everything, calling it a political attack. But Bondi and her team had the evidence. The country watched as subpoenas were issued. High-profile arrests were made, and the biggest corruption scandal in decades came crashing down. As the dust settled, Bondi knew one thing for certain. This was never just about one judge. This was about restoring faith in the justice system. And though this battle had been won, the war against, as Pam Bondi's crusade against corruption reached the highest levels of power, the threats against her escalated. Federal agents advised her to increase her security, and her legal team urged her to proceed with caution. But caution had never been her style. One evening, as she was leaving a private meeting with investigators, she noticed the same black SUV trailing her. Instead of heading home, she made a sudden turn and drove straight to the nearest police station. The SUV sped off before she could get a closer look, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her to know they were watching. The investigation was moving fast. The FBI had begun issuing arrest warrants for high-ranking officials, including judges, attorneys, and even law enforcement officers who had participated in the decades-long corruption scheme. The scandal dominated the news, with reporters uncovering shocking details about backdoor deals, rigged court cases, and the millions of dollars exchanged in bribes. Then, a stunning development changed everything. Daniel Reeves, the whistleblower, who had exposed the corruption, was attacked outside his home. He survived, but barely. As he lay in the hospital, he whispered one final warning to Bondi. "There's a name missing from the list. The real mastermind." Bondi's blood ran cold. She had assumed they had already uncovered the top players in the scheme. But Reeves insisted there was someone more powerful, someone who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. Before he could say more, his condition worsened, and he was rushed into emergency surgery. Determined to uncover the truth, Bondi and her team went back through the files, searching for any name that had been overlooked. And then they found it. A single email buried deep within the evidence, linking a powerful billionaire, someone who had funded political campaigns, owned media outlets, and had deep ties to Washington, to the entire operation. This wasn't just a corrupt judge or senator. This was a man with near unlimited resources, someone who could buy his way out of almost anything. The moment Bondi's team discovered the connection, strange things started happening. Key evidence in the FBI's possession mysteriously disappeared. A crucial witness recanted their testimony. Bondi's office was broken into, though nothing was stolen, just papers scattered, a clear warning. Then came the final blow. Bondi received a direct message from the billionaire himself, a simple, chilling sentence. "You're playing a dangerous game, Pam. Walk away while you still can." She knew what it meant. This man wasn't just threatening her career, he was threatening her life. But she had come too far to stop now. With you, the nation watching, she took the biggest risk of her career. She held a live press conference, revealing everything she had found. She named names. She laid out the financial records. She exposed the emails, the bank accounts, the hidden offshore transactions. The billionaire responded exactly as expected. He denied everything, called it a conspiracy theory, and threatened to sue. But the pressure was mounting. The FBI, now under public scrutiny, had no choice but to move forward. Arrests were made, search warrants executed, and within days, the billionaire's empire began to crumble. And then, in a final twist, an insider from his own company turned on him, providing the last piece of evidence needed to bring him down. Pam Bondi had done the impossible. She had taken on not just a corrupt system, but one of the most powerful men in the country, and won. As the billionaire was led away in handcuffs, Bondi stood before the cameras one last time. "This isn't just about one man," she said. This is about every person who has ever been denied justice because of corruption. Today, we take a step toward fixing that, and I promise you, this is just the beginning. Because if there was one thing she had proven, it was that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law. The billionaire's arrest sent shockwaves through the country. The trial that followed became one of the most highly publicized legal battles in history. His legal team, composed of some of the most expensive and ruthless attorneys in the world, fought tooth and nail to discredit the case. They claimed Bondi was on a political witch hunt, that the evidence had been fabricated, and that their client was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by his enemies. But Bondi had anticipated this. She had prepared meticulously, ensuring that every piece of evidence was airtight, every witness protected, and every legal move calculated. Despite the billionaire's efforts to stall the proceedings, the case moved forward. Testimonies from former associates painted a damning picture of a man who had built his empire on corruption, bribery, and blackmail. Secret recordings were played in court, conversations where he openly discussed manipulating judges, rigging elections, and silencing his opponents. Then, in a dramatic moment that stunned the courtroom, his most trusted advisor, the very person who had once helped him cover his tracks, flipped. Under the weight of federal charges, the advisor turned state's witness, revealing the inner workings of the billionaire's empire. He detailed how judges were bought, politicians were controlled, and even how threats were carried out against those who stood in the way. The jury deliberated for days, and the world held its breath. When they finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom was packed, reporters broadcasting the decision live to millions. Guilty on all counts. The billionaire sat in stunned silence as the judge handed down his sentence. Decades behind bars, with no chance of early release. The empire he had spent his life building crumbled in an instant. Pam Bondi, standing outside the courthouse, addressed the nation. Today, justice has prevailed. But this fight isn't over. Corruption doesn't just exist in one courtroom, one company, or one political office. It exists wherever people put power and money above the law. And as long as that corruption exists, we will fight it. As the crowds erupted into cheers, Bondi knew she had done what many thought was impossible. She had taken on the most powerful forces in the country, and won. But she also knew that new battles lay ahead. There would always be those who sought to exploit the system, those who believed they were untouchable. And as long as they existed, she would be there to bring them down, because the war against corruption was far from over. Months after the billionaire's conviction, the dust finally began to settle. The corruption scandal had reshaped the nation, leading to sweeping reforms. In the judicial and political systems, new laws were passed to prevent bribery and misconduct. Oversight committees were established, and trust in the justice system slowly began to rebuild. Pam Bondi had become a symbol of justice, a relentless fighter who had stood against the most powerful forces and emerged victorious. But after years of battling corruption, exposing scandals, and putting dangerous criminals behind bars, she knew it was time for something new. One evening, as she sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline, she realized the war she had fought had taken its toll. The long nights, the threats, the endless battles, it had all been worth it, but she was ready to pass the torch. At a press conference the following week, she made an announcement that surprised many. "I have dedicated my life to fighting corruption, and I will always stand for justice," she said. "But now, it's time to step aside and let the next generation continue the fight. I have faith that the system we've worked so hard to fix will only grow stronger. And though I may be leaving the courtroom, I will never stop believing in the power of truth and justice." The crowd erupted in applause. Some were saddened by her departure, but most understood. She had done more than anyone could have asked. She had restored faith in the system, brought down some of the most corrupt figures in history, and inspired countless others to stand up against injustice. In the months that followed, Bondi took a step back from the public eye. She traveled, spent time with her family, and even began writing a book about her experiences. But no matter where she went, people still recognized her, thanking her for standing up when no one else would. And though she was no longer in the Waiua courtroom, she knew her fight had made a difference. Because corruption would always exist, but so would those willing to stand against it. As she watched the sunset from her porch one evening, she smiled, knowing that justice had prevailed. Not just for her, but for the people she had fought for. Her war was over, but the legacy of what she had done would last forever. And so, Pam Bondi closed this chapter of her life, knowing she had given everything in the fight for justice. The battles she had won reshaped the system, exposing the corruption that once thrived in the shadows. Her name would be remembered not just as a prosecutor, but as a warrior who never backed down. As she walked away from the world of trials and investigations, she carried no regrets, only the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. Justice had prevailed, and with that, her story came to an end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more thrilling narratives like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay tuned for more powerful stories of justice, courage, and the fight against corruption. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Subscribe now and be part of the movement that stands for truth.